the first couple of questions are really around sustainability and I guess adoption of learning team approaches. And the first one was about the GATE project in Sierra Leone, Deborah, and about to what extent, or what is the route to sustainability for the programme? I guess both in working with teacher training institutions and teacher training colleges, and in the women graduating from the programme, working in schools. So would you be able to answer that one first?
Yeah, I think you can look at it at different angles, as we talked earlier on about being bottom up, and certainly from a community point of view, this is very much welcome to see more women in schools and to see women, particularly because this is a sort of grow your own model. So we're not talking about moving resources around on a spreadsheet and bringing people in from urban areas who then go home on the Friday afternoon. They live there all the time. So from a community level, it's very much welcomed. I think there is some further work to do at teacher training level and reforms there to look at the barriers to entry to teacher training college. And I think in terms of finances, the actual bursary that we gave to the women was quite small, and the issue is around supporting them all the way, really. But as schools have certainly become more used to working in teams and seeing people, and opening up their classrooms. So I think there's a lot of scope there, but there's still some work to do.
Thank you. It would also be good, Tony, to hear from you about how you're working with the Ministry of Health around, I guess, how did that partnership come about, and how is that model sustainable? Like how is the time, for example, paid by the community health workers to support education? I'd just be interested to hear about that.
Sure. I think it's an instructive story in terms of harnessing of existing resource, so that there's a cost, but it's a relatively small marginal cost, and the return on investment, if you like, of that modest cost is quite considerable, because there's a kind of multiplier effect, because these folks were there already. And the synergy, the bringing together of, if you like, already existing resource in the schools, in the health system, generates this great benefit, I think. So it's a question of understanding, if you like, well, the system as it is, and what resources are there, and how we can harness those existing resources, perhaps with some additional marginal investment. And we were very fortunate in that we've actually been we've had the privilege of working in Kenya for, I don't know, 20, 30 years. And so our colleagues really understand the ecosystem. And it's a question of, well, what is the specific, political economy in part around here? And it depends on relationships and getting to know people. And it was also an application, if you like, of the theory, because when we were designing our intervention, understandably, we looked to the international literature about effective interventions for vulnerable girl children. And, not surprisingly, the literature says that cross-sectoral approaches, integrated approaches, multi-agency approaches are very promising. So we brought together, if you like, the research plus what we knew about the system.
Great, thanks very much, Tony. And just to ask, I'll leave this open as to who would like to respond, but one person has asked, to what extent have ministries of education taken on board, either in terms of adapting teacher training or perhaps new roles or new ways of working as a result of the work you've been doing? So Rukmini, you obviously talked about heavily working with district officials. How did you get that buy-in, and how did you get that state and district to commit time from their their people to transition to this, more team-based and teaching at the right level approach?
So I think there are several shifts that were needed. Firstly, and again, I can't speak outside of the experience of India, but you're coming from a system which has focused largely on how to expand provision and how to provide for more teachers, more schools, very input oriented. And so I would say that the processes to keep a input oriented system in place are very different from when you are needing to support children's learning. And so while I think that people accept that the work on enrollment and provisioning has gone quite far, but these internal dynamics of when you have to inspect a building, you can perhaps use a checklist. But when you have to support the growth of children and the scaffolding by teachers, maybe a checklist is not as useful as actually firsthand experience. So, and I know this is a problem in many of the sub-Saharan countries where, my colleagues are beginning to work, is that there isn't provision made for people to travel from school to school to provide support. And so, how do you make this whole business that the teaching and learning is quite dynamic? For me to be able to help you, it's not just you come to training college and get trained and then you're out there by yourself. How do I come to your class quite frequently and see what your problems are? How do we, as a team of 10 schools, help each other? I think these are all go well beyond teaching at the right level. I think they go from in my mind, they go from moving from a system which focused largely on having every child in school to now focusing on how do you get every child to learn. In addition to that, I would say that this distance from home and school, in India, almost half of our children have mothers who didn't have much schooling themselves. And so you are actually quite nervous to approach a school and actually I can go and talk about why did my daughter not get a scholarship? What about her entitlement for uniforms? But it's much harder for me to go and say, okay, what do I do about, 2-digit subtraction? So the early childhood part that I described, I think that people being together, really helps because you get strength from each other. You're not a mom acting alone. You have your friends with you. And you also have sometimes, and I think this is common across all our programs, the community volunteer is often an alumni of the same school. So she's kind of halfway, between us. So, I'm not saying that everybody just accepts this notion of teams. The notion of leaders of practice is often accepted in principle and often very difficult to push into practice. And if at all we hold our ground when we are talking to governments, we are very, two things. One is that you have to give people, the trainers, time to practice it themselves. And two is that you have to give whoever has trained the opportunity to be able to support the schools. So that training is seen as step 0 and not as the only step. And it's really in this evolve. And once this team has done its stuff in one phase, you learn so many things that almost automatically people want to do it again at maybe a higher level because you know where you succeeded, you know where you failed. So I think it's something that you have to have some missionaries in the system. And I think Deborah spoke about that as well, that, who are the champions, and you've got to make the champions, Olympic champions next, and because they'll carry the other people with them.
Thank you, Rukmini. We've had a question around what has been the reaction of teachers to either having other roles, work with them or support them, and whether it affected, I guess, the definition of their role. So I might ask Deborah that to start with, because the learning assistants would have been working directly in the classroom with teachers, and then invite anyone else to add.
Thank you. Yes, I think in each of these schools where the learning assistants were working, they were supported by their head teachers or a senior teacher, so that people understood that having someone in the classroom wasn't about the teacher then disappearing to go and do something else, but it took some change to work in teams, and that these young women were becoming teachers, that they're not yet teachers. So there was some advice given about doing work with small groups or preparing resources and so on. And I think it helps that the itinerant teachers use the same sort of in-school model. So they were showing teachers how to use local resources to adapt materials in a very hands-on way for children with disabilities, and doing work about particular children who might have had behavioural difficulties, so they could see that disability is not just about physical disabilities. So I think it's a drip feed over time of people working together, building up trust and so on. And I think it does help that, for the learning systems, that they came from the community and unknown.
Thank you. And Tony, what about you? How did it work with the teachers trusting the health workers to maintain this continuity of learning?
Yeah, and I think it's a really good question. I think we shouldn't make naive assumptions about how easy this is, and I think we need to take intentional action. Simply providing a new resource isn't necessarily going to be welcomed by folks. They may think, hang on a minute, are they meant to be teachers? I thought I was the teacher. They may see it as a threat to their professionalism. They may think, don't these people know how hard I'm working? They're asking me to do. So I think you need to do what we did was a kind of risk analysis, if you like. How will this go wrong? And put an emphasis on training, so that there's a real socialization of the approach, but not in a turn up at the workshop, we'll tell you how it's going to work away. You need maybe some of that, but more a kind of problem solving collaborative approach to the new approach. So I think clarity about getting the professional learning right is really important. And then I'd emphasize in particular the pivotal role of the school principal as the person who you need to get on board as the champion of the team approach, who will promote it, but also monitor it and quality assure it and explain it to parents who are maybe a little bit, parents can be very conservative about changes. So I'd emphasize the right approach to training and socialization and the role of the head teachers.
Great, thank you. And we've had a follow-on question, which I'll ask you, Lucy, to start with, about what do you think the particular policy hurdles are to creating team-based models? I know you do a lot of work with governments as part of your work. How have you addressed any specific policy hurdles, and what do you think some initial steps could be taken to help consider how to work in a team-based way more systematically?
Thanks, Amy. I would pick up on 2 points in relation to that. I think one is having, and this is picking up on some of Tony's points, having a very clear definition to the respective roles within learning teams. And so in our case, looking at the learner guide, being very clear that this isn't a role that is an additional unqualified teacher within the system, because I think that in itself creates great demand and issues for the young woman who's in that position. And so I think having those real clarity of the different roles within the learning team is fundamental. But the other side of it, as I would say, is the costing issue. I think having very clear, detailed costing analysis of what's involved in a learning team in order to be able to consider how and which costs and in which way are applicable within the school system and beyond the school system and can be captured under other budgets, including in health, for example. So that very detailed costing analysis, I would say, for us, has been at the core of the kind of policy discussions that we've been able to progress.
Great, thank you. Rukmini or Deborah or Tony, would you like to add anything to that question?
So I don't know if I'm addressing the policy challenge. I see a lot of institutional challenges. we work in largely hierarchical systems where, let's say, even at the state level or the district level, there is, if I look at, for example, our teacher training faculties often have not been in the classroom for a long time. And so when you bring into play this leaders of practice, often the most successful trainers and the leaders of teachers become people who have practiced really well. And I think this upsets systems a bit, and I think it's the right kind of upset, because you need the teachers that begin to demand that send these people who really know how to help me in my classroom and are able to solve my problems. Data has helped a great deal in this. I think, to me, good use of data is firstly, it brings some, you're able to highlight what is happening in the classroom, which is often invisible to people who are far away. But you're also able to show that, as a team, we were able to do this. So in India, we have a layer called a cluster coordinator who has about, anywhere between 10, 15 schools. And a lot of the discussion at that level is between my cluster and your cluster, and, who needs more help and so on. So I think that depending on at what level the progress of the program is reviewed, you can actually bring in this, the discussion of data brings in also, different aspects of this teamwork. So it's not a smooth process, but I still feel that if you want to move towards learning being the core of this, you have to shake up a system which was structured for something else. The big fight is on curriculum, because this, a large part of the learning crisis, according to me, is because of what Land Pritchett calls the negative consequences of an overambitious curriculum. And so much of this teaching at the right level is saying, get the foundations right. So who made the curriculum and for whom? And often teachers will say, why were we not consulted on what is okay with the... So I mean, I'm a great believer that some amount of questioning and disruption it's easier to do that as a team, much more difficult as an individual.
Great, thank you very much. So I'd like to ask a question now about technology and how technology can support working within a team. And there's a specific question to start with for you, Deborah, about how technology was used as part of the GATE program and how you ensured it was reliable. And then I'll open it out to others. Thank you.
Yeah, I think we have to think about technology that's appropriate for the context. So for the learning assistants, when we gave them this specially written book so they could get their maths and English up to speed for teacher training colleges, they initially asked, is it okay if I write in it? Even though it had been designed with space in it, because it was the first time that they'd been able to write in their own book. So in that context, the technology of the book and the pen was really important. We later put some of that material onto tablets, and there are issues about charging and the cost it costs to charge them. But by having things on tablets, we were able to put a lot more OER from our TESA and our TES India programs and so on to sort of widen out. And similarly, you can see that in COVID, the ministry had a catch-up program on radio, but for many children, the radio doesn't even reach the hardest to the furthest away regions because of transmission problems and so on. And we're starting to use telephone tuition now. It is a pilot. Because the child doesn't have her own phone, and so that needs to be pre-arranged, and the family have to be on board, and they might need the phone for their own work in the market and so on. So I think there are some challenges to technology, but obviously lots of the learning assistants, the young women, are using WhatsApp and they're using phones to communicate with each other, to film each other, little practice clips and so on. So there's great potential, I think, there. But we also have to be realistic about what the extremely challenges are in that low resource environment.
Thank you. Would any others of you like to comment on how technology is helping learning teams?
Just to really endorse what Deborah said about the appropriate, realistic technology in terms of the story just now with the CHVs in Kenya. I mean, we all know this, maybe I'm just stating the obvious, but policymakers, I'm not in Kenya, just like a global phenomenon, they like the glamour of high technology. And I think one of the most interesting aspects of the global story just now is the kind of the resurgence of the low technology. I mean, Deborah's right. Even that's not accessible to many millions of children. But you know, our community health volunteers SMS texting data about participation levels of individual girls, creating data using that relatively low tech, encouraging at household level the families to let the girl listen to the radio if they've got a radio. I think that's made a big difference.
Thank you. Rukmini, did you want to add?
Yeah, I wanted to add an angle that we've seen playing out, and I think in a more obvious way during the pandemic, is that when you have the teams with mixed age groups, often, for example, in this instructor, mother, and community volunteer grouping, it's often the young teenager who is more curious about using technology and then bringing that benefit to the others. So we see technology, we see this, the potential of technology as a trigger, as opposed to it being, kind of the digital content being the, the end to the means, or I don't know, I'm getting mixed up here with my own metaphors. But I think that we've seen across the board, even within Pratham, we had to do a very accelerated learning for getting everybody onto being comfortable with devices and with remote activity. And, you could see almost everybody said, I'm glad my son was home, my daughter was home, because I didn't know how to do this, I didn't know how to do that. So in many ways, it turns the tables on the usual hierarchies. We find that giving our young mothers even a shared device, raises their prestige in the community, because this woman has a device that often the men folk in her family doesn't have. So the social structure onto which the technology lands, I think, is very key. And the feedback that comes back, I think, is also important. So I feel like, in addition to the fact that through COVID, we've learned that, radio or SMS is still quite useful. I think what we've learned is that the social structures onto which particularly shared things landed was very powerful in bringing the group together in a new way. And I see this across. We've done a lot of the similar trainings with our government folks, where the actual training may be maybe on whatever pedagogy, but the person who's part of the workshop says, I'm now regarded as the person who can connect others to the rest of the world. So my value has gone up.
That's absolutely fascinating. I hadn't really considered that, the impact of the social structure and the device on the social standing. That's fascinating. Thank you. So I just want to encourage others to submit questions before I ask the next one, but please do submit a couple more questions. We'll have time for 2 to 3 more. So one person has asked, can we start with one piece of the learning teams model? And could that, for example, be volunteer community learning assistance, for example? And they were asking what incentives are given to volunteers to sustain their contribution. So I will ask that maybe to Lucy to start with, and then or Rukmini, you go ahead if you like to first.
We've been playing with this idea in different forms over time, and it's called education for education. So if you give some time for, say, the younger kids in your neighborhood, then what can you get back in return? Not in terms of money, but in terms of something which is learning for you. And this, we used to do this some years ago with kind of just learning Microsoft Office. We've moved to a whole variety of things. But I think the notion is quite powerful. And again, we don't expect that somebody will be a volunteer forever. But, I often say that, Teach for India or Teach for America is somebody from far away who comes in. This is actually just teach for your own neighborhood, which is a lot easier to do. And there is a sense in which that I have to give back, as well. So our education for education kind of idea, I think it has quite a bit of traction, and that you hand over, it's like a relay race. So when you feel you've done a couple of months, you've gotten your course, you hand it over to your friend, because in a way you must have this regenerative, I feel the durability comes not from the same person being in it forever, but from, there is a refreshing, change that people can bring. So right now, for example, just as a quick example, we are doing, as part of education for education, especially in our early years programs, we are doing a first aid course. Very unusual in India to have a first aid course available in the community, which is being done partly on WhatsApp and partly on Zoom and partly on any shared device that you have. And I'm curious to see, because with some of our other courses, once the community volunteers have done it, the instructors demand it as well, because there is very little adult learning opportunities outside of training that is available to our, whoever wants to learn some more. So it's almost like the education for education is like a little trailer of the possibilities that may come. And we want not just community volunteers, but people in the community to say, geez, I want to learn about this whole first aid business as well. So that hasn't happened yet, but I'm hoping that it will, catch on.
Fantastic, thank you. Lucy, how do you incentivize your learner guides?
Sure. I mean, well, I think there's 3 points I'd pick up on, but just going back to the first part of the question as well, around whether you can take one dimension of this. I mean, I do think it is important to be able to drill down and show the different components, and that goes back to the point around costing the different components as well, because I think that they become more digestible if you can, and to show the value of the synergy among them. But in terms of the sustainable incentive, that has been a critical dimension to thinking about how this can be integrated and adopted at scale within government systems. And I would say there's sort of 3 approaches that we've taken to that. One is very much along the lines of what Rukmini has just shared, and what we've kind of considered social interest. It's almost like you have had an investment, you've had opportunities opened out for you, and this is a way to be able to reinvest in having taken receipt of those opportunities. So I think exploring that dimension is of value. Related to that is that often what we found is that within other ministries there are programs related to opening up opportunities for young people in the transition on from school, some kind of civic engagement and service opportunities that are there, or opening up low interest access to low interest financial resources. And I think some of these opportunities for young people can be tagged into this kind of give back into the education system approach. So that engagement with other ministries is critical. And then thirdly, for us, what has been vital, and I think others, including Deborah, have alluded to this kind of opportunity, is the accreditation piece. I think finding ways in which these roles can be accredited if the standards of engagement have been achieved does allow for a stepping stone into formal teacher training or into other forms of employment. And I think that accreditation is a really valuable dimension to the incentive, and one that can be scaled.
Great, thank you very much, Lucy. So one final question I'm going to ask you. It's been fantastic to have all of you here today sharing, I guess, your take on learning teams. I know you've been running your programs for many years, so it's trying to think about how they support this concept. But how do you think we can use this opportunity in time really to create a tipping point to encourage governments, implementing organisation, teachers, parents, families to really think about this team-based approach? And what do you think that we as the Commission and practitioners, researchers can do to create perhaps a community of practice or transformation. And I will pick up on a question that was asked about the media. What role could the media play? So does anyone have any initial thoughts on that?
I guess if I could have first go, I did a very obvious observation, but this clearly, this terrible moment in human history is an opportunity for us to think in practical terms how we're going to do things differently. So everybody's, sharing the rhetoric of building back better, but well, how are we going to build back better? How are we going to make sure that the new system is better than that system before? Because it wasn't that brilliant for many, many kids. So for sure, there is an opportunity that there ought to be on the part of people of goodwill, policymakers of goodwill, a degree of receptivity to some creative thinking just now.
Great, thank you. Anyone else have any suggestions on how we do that? Rukmini or Lucy, go for it.
Well, Amy, I would say that I think there is a real opportunity, and through the media, to pick up on some of the narratives of the day. So I think what we've seen recently is a lot of discourse around the fact that women are carrying a lot of the burden of the pandemic in relation to childcare, in relation to support and to schooling. And so I think there is a real opportunity to lift that and recognise the role that many women are playing in support for education, and what more resource and additional learning support do they need. And so I think there are entry points to this issue that we can find in the current narrative that is within the media, to be able to make the case for learning teams and to bring recognition and value to the role that others have been playing over this period. So I think it is a real moment to pick up on some of those narratives.
Great, thank you.
I agree with what's been said, and I think it's also a moment to tell some of the invisible stories through the media of those children who have not had access and who are more subject to violence and safeguarding issues, but also who've shown great initiative and creativity in trying to find different ways to learn despite the circumstances.
Thanks, Deborah. And Rukmini?
If I can just pick up on Tony's question about how do you build back better and how can this learning teams approach be integrated? To me, there's a very, very straightforward way. One is that, because at least maybe, I'm talking about India where schools have been closed for a whole year and we are not holding children back. So our new school year begins in April. And so, last March when schools closed, you were in 3rd grade, should have gone into 4th grade in April 2020. And in April 21, you're going to be in 5th grade. So it's absolutely obvious that I cannot pick up the 5th grade textbook and teach it to these kids because they had a pretty indifferent 3rd grade and no 4th grade whatsoever. And yet, if we acknowledge the fact that there's this big catch up is going to be needed, not just for the last 1 year, but for, whatever was the condition before. I just go back to the fact that earlier, I, as a 3rd grade teacher, had to deal with my 3rd grade textbook and whoever was in my so-called 3rd grade class, where there were kids all the way from 3rd grade till kindergarten in terms of levels of, whatever the basic learning was. And I was supposed to deal with all of that myself. Now, because we have this horrible period, and I often refer to this, that there's a new demon and you can blame the demon for everything. I will put aside, I hope our governments do that, put aside the 4th and 5th grade textbook and say, let's just go back to make sure that everybody remembers how to read. And if not, let's teach them. And that I have to do as a team because I'm moving from my row of being age, grade, and tied to my curriculum to the columns where there may be kids at different levels and they're not at that different age. And so if as 3 teachers, I can do this, and our job is to get everybody in 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade, at least up to the basic foundation level, I can't do it alone. It's much more efficient for me to do it as a team. So the policy decision has to be put aside your grade level curriculum and hit this goal. There was a question from Madhu Ranjan in the chat about the new education policy. We have a new education policy in India, which says get to the foundational learning goals. And that's a golden opportunity for us, using that and the fact that COVID disrupted schools in such a bad way, to say you've got to do something different. So the different is put your curriculum aside and do it as a team.
Thank you so much, Rukmini. And just a final comment I wanted to share from Brent Madden from ASU, who has shared practically what they're doing in the US context to make it happen. And he says there are several points of entry. So one, placing teacher candidates in 2s or 3s with 1 or more professional educators to create teams. 2, working with community educators as members of the team with very clear roles and ideally pathways for professional roles. 3, building 1 to 2 team-based models in single schools so that you have a demonstration of how this could work and networking those teams together. And then finally, focusing on building cohorts of leaders who are interested and able to build these teams of professionals to work together. So I thought they were a very helpful summary of some potential entry points to take this forward. So I will hand back over to Lisbeth to wrap up, but thank you all very much.
Great, thank you so much. And I am left with the impossible task of actually summarizing what you've all said. But I will actually try, because I think this is such a fascinating conversation. And I also think that we are coming together around a kind of common set of issues, and that helping to make those issues come to life is going to be the start of the transformation. And I just, in a sort of quick summary, I would say I heard in the very beginning this concept of simultaneous renewal. I think it was Carol who said it, which kind of says we need to be changing at all levels. And that brings us immediately to this idea of systems, of course. And it's not just kind of creating these teams across all the levels of the system, but also actually creating them within the levels and going backwards, going into teacher education and going into the pipeline of people who are coming into the profession. So there's sort of almost a horizontal and a vertical way of bringing things together and creating that change. And I think all these examples about bringing so young people into this as agents of change, I think is really important and something we need to pay greater attention to. The other issue that came up a lot, which we would like to pay more attention to, is this cross-sectoral issue. I thought the example that we heard about from the healthcare workers and how they've been used all of a sudden to help progress education goals is really important to keep in mind and move on in the future. The point of leadership came back again and again, and I really loved Rukmini's Olympic champions. I think there's an issue of identifying change leaders. So who are our champions and can we make them Olympic champions? But then there is also just leadership writ large, instructional leadership, as Amy was saying. In each and every case, we need to reorient leaders towards learning and not kind of simply ticking administrative boxes. And again, within that leadership, I think the role of young people is really important, and those who are entering the system could really rise to help things change. I also heard the word data quite a lot, not only to know what's happening in classrooms, Rukmini, you emphasized that, but also, thank you, Lucy, how much does it cost? And that is something I worry about a lot, costing and financing. If we could get to a place where we can also demonstrate that this approach doesn't necessarily need to cost more, and in fact could be more efficient in many cases, because the current arrangement is not producing any learning. So if we actually get more learning out of, even if it costs a little more, the effectiveness of it will be so much greater. And I think finally, I was thinking about this issue of how do we create a transformation and the tipping point. And throughout the conversation, we keep saying it's very context specific. We need to really think about a particular context to talk about learning teams. But I think we have today realized that there is a lot of commonality as well. And trying to codify that commonality, I think, is really important to make sure that we can create a message that transcends our individual projects and ideas. So if we can somehow bring that together under an umbrella, so we are all doing, whether it's the pratams or the work that's going on with the healthcare workers, we can sort of bring it all under a kind of under the same umbrella and communicate that in an effective way. And again, Rukmini, I thought your columns and your the sort of rows and columns go from focusing on levels, your rows, rather focus on the children who, I suppose, the sort of different levels that children are at is really important here as well. So we need to try and aggregate things. That's something that we will be thinking about a lot, and communicating this new way of doing things and using the media for this, I think, is a really good idea. Just to a final reflection is, we are seeing India returning to school in April, and in other parts of the world there will be returns to school at different points in the year. Maybe one thing we could consider is launching some kind of campaign that really identifies which countries are opening when, and kind of reiterate this message each time that a country opens up. That might be a way of kind of keeping the drumbeat basically going. So I'd just finally want to say thank you so much. The Education Commission is really committed to trying to create this transformation and this momentum, and really very much working with you all on doing is what we're trying to do is aggregate both through the research that we are doing and kind of looking at what the evidence out there is, bringing that together in ways that is easy to access, including this codification is one of the things that we are really trying to clarify. We also are working in some countries to test new approaches, and many of these countries and the country cases are actually in partnership with all of you. And we want to document that to be able to then do the third thing, which is this global change, this global transformation. And we are still looking for ideas as to how we can do that final bit effectively, because it's great to have everything happening in the different countries, but at the end of the day, we need to get to a place where globally everybody is talking about this and everybody is moving in that direction. So we're looking for leveraging a sort of network of champions also at the global level to drive the dialogue forward. So thank you so much. We've passed time with 3 or 4 minutes, and for some of you, it's already quite late. Thank you for those of you in Asia. And we are looking forward to continuing this conversation.